Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Beat Sculptor. I had a number of people comment on how they like the drums or percussion on a recent beat that I posted called Half Past Golden Hour. So I want to just break down what my thought process behind creating a drum pattern like that. But first, here's just a quick example of the full beat. The first rule of thumb here is that you can't do a more involved, intricate drum pattern on something that's more complicated. So what I mean by that, if I take the drums and the bass away, you're left with just a very simple, straightforward loop. And that's the perfect kind of loop to do a more involved drum part on. So if you're trying to do a more interesting drum part and it's not working, it might just be that it's over something too complex. But I want to break down the drum part a little bit. So really, here's the drum part alone. You might hear that and think, wow, there's kind of a lot going on, and there is, but what I wanted to show you is that at the core of every more complicated drum part is something a lot more basic. And what I mean by that is you can break down most drum rhythms to their fundamentals. It's a bass drum, a snare drum, and hi-hat. And if I strip everything down to just the basic drum pattern, you get something like this. The first three bars are really just a very standard, straightforward hip-hop rhythm with a fast hi-hat. And then the fourth bar, there's just this little turnaround where I flip around where typically the snare had been landing in the middle of each bar. Now I put it at the beginning of the bar. So it gives you a nice feeling of the drums continue moving along with that kind of turnaround at the end. But it's still just a very simple pattern. For the first three bars with a little turnaround at the end. And what I would encourage you to do is try to build a drum pattern just very simply like that first without trying to get too fancy. And then once you want to start adding in sort of the spices and the more fancy things, I would think about it in a few different ways. Number one, try to add things that complement the existing pattern that you already have. So this bass drum hit here is part of just that fundamental pattern that I showed you a second ago. You can complement those hits in the basic pattern with additional accents. So what I did here is I added a third hi-hat part which hits along with that with a little roll. And it just emphasizes that offbeat and it creates a nice texture above the bass drum hit. One trick if you want your bass drums to stand out more is actually add more treble range accents or high pitch accents to those. It will cue the ear to the fact that something is happening there and then actually help the listener tune into the bass drum more. So that's the first thing, is think about adding to the hits that you already have. Secondly, think about adding things that are reactionary to your fundamental pattern. So here's this is the snare right in the middle of the bar. It's part of the core rhythm here. But what I did is I added the second hi-hat part that sort of reacts to that. So it hits with the snare, but then there's an extra hit after that, which gives this sense of sort of almost like an echo or an additional bounce to the drums. And you can hear that second hit after the snare. And so it gives this just feeling that, there's more happening than just a snare hit, that there's things sort of happening as a reaction to that. And this is actually how a drummer might actually play. They might play a secondary ghost note after the main hit, and that helps give it a little bit of texture. And then you can think about anticipating your core hits. So again, we've got this snare here in the middle of the bar, but you can lead into that with an auxiliary snare or like a higher pitch snare. Sometimes they might call that a bounce snare. And it gives a sense that you're really kind of moving into that snare hit, and you can see I've adjusted the dynamics so it's lower in volume. So if I made this higher in dynamics, it would overtake that. and that wouldn't sound very good. It sounds a little unbalanced or a little bit off. So you want to make sure to keep the accents on the main snare rhythm while adding these other sort of more secondary notes. And this again is how our drummer would think. That's literally how they would play ghost notes on a snare drum. So if you want to improve your drum production, go to YouTube and research and kind of look at ghost notes and how a drummer would actually play. Here's another example here leading into the snare hit. This is a snare roll increasing in volume leading up to that snare hit there. And so there is a lot more going on here. You know, one thing to also do is in your main snare is add some extra hits. This is again how a drummer would play. So your lead-in to the main hits can be from a different sound or drum, but you can also add other accents on the main drum pattern as well. And as you can see, there's a lot more to go into here. There's things around dynamics. As you can see, I've kept the main hi-hat the same dynamic, but then I've kind of made it interesting by adding a shaper box to that with an auto pan. And if you listen closely, you'll hear that main hi-hat go from left to right. So even though it's all the same dynamic, which would generally sound kind of dull, because the panning is going back and forth and we have these extra hi-hat hits, that tends to make it a bit more interesting. So finally, I'll just play the whole beat again with all the elements in here. Actually, what I'll do is I'll start it at just the basic drum pattern, and then you'll get to hear how it leads in. Hope this helps. I'm Beat Sculptor on Instagram. You can find my YouTube channels, Dan Shore Music, and my Type Beat channel, which is just getting started, is Beat Sculptor. And I'm also on Twitter at Dan_Shore, S-H-U-R-E, where I do talk mostly about the marketing and SEO work that I do, but also share some of my music as well. Okay, here's the basic drum pattern and then the full beat.